This was a mistake. The thought echoed in Henry Callahan's mind, drowning out the clatter of plates and the low hum of conversation in the diner. He clutched his lukewarm coffee cup, his knuckles white. Across the small table, his 7-year-old daughter Clara was meticulously coloring a placemat, blissfully unaware of the social train wreck she had engineered. A blind date. It was a terrible idea 5 years ago, and it was a catastrophic one now, especially with his daughter sitting right here as an unwilling third wheel. The bell above the diner door jingled, and Henry's stomach plummeted. A young woman stood there, her eyes scanning the room with a nervous uncertainty that he felt in his own bones. When her gaze landed on him and then immediately dropped to Clara, he braced for impact. He saw the flicker of surprise in her eyes and prepared for the polite, tight-lipped smile that meant, "You brought your kid? I'm out of here, but that's not what happened." The woman, Ilara, walked toward their table, her steps hesitant but deliberate. She stopped, but instead of looking at him, she knelt, bringing herself down to eye level with his daughter. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft and completely free of judgment. "You must be Clara," she said, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. "I'm Ilara. I have to say, that is a very artistic-looking dinosaur you're coloring." Clara, who usually hid behind Henry's leg when meeting strangers, looked up, her crayon pausing mid-stroke. She eyed Ilara for a moment before pointing a purple crayon at the drawing. "He's a stegosaurus, but I made him purple because purple is the best color." Ilara's smile widened. "Purple is definitely the best color. It's a scientific fact." Henry felt the knot in his chest loosen just a fraction. He finally found his voice, a little rougher than he intended. "I'm sorry about this. My sitter, Mrs. Gable, had a last-minute emergency." Ilara finally stood and looked at him, her eyes a warm, gentle brown. "Please don't be sorry. It's nice to meet you both." She slid into the vinyl booth opposite them. "I'm Henry," he said, extending a hand across the table. Her grip was firm but brief, her hand cool. "It's really good to meet you, Ilara." For the first time, he got a proper look at her. She wasn't wearing anything fancy, just a simple gray sweater and jeans. Her dark hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and she wore almost no makeup. There was a quietness about her, a shyness in the way she held her shoulders, that was entirely disarming. She looked kind. It was a simple word, but it was the only one that fit. The silence that followed was a little awkward, but not the suffocating kind he had dreaded. He could thank his daughter for that. "My dad works in a super tall building with lots of shiny windows," Clara announced proudly, deciding the introductions were over and it was time for the interrogation. "He cleans everything so it's not yucky." Henry felt a flush of embarrassment creep up his neck. "Clara." But Ilara just leaned forward, her interest seeming completely unforced. "Really? That sounds like a very important job. It takes a lot of care to keep a big place looking nice." "He's the best at it," Clara declared. "He can make a window so clean a bird might fly right into it." A bird did once. It was sad, but then it got up and flew away, so it was okay. Henry couldn't help but let out a small laugh, a sound that felt foreign and rusty. "Okay, Mission Commander. I think Ilara gets the picture." He looked at Ilara, offering a small, apologetic shrug. "My daughter was the one who orchestrated this." With some help from our neighbor, he didn't need to explain the rest. He didn't need to talk about the last 5 years, about the gaping hole his wife, Sarah, had left behind. A silence so profound that most days he still didn't know how to fill it. He didn't need to say that Clara's mission to find him a new smile was both heartbreakingly sweet and utterly terrifying. "Well, she has excellent taste in diners," Ilara said smoothly, picking up a menu. "Their milkshakes are legendary." She looked at Clara. "I bet a purple dinosaur artist like you would appreciate a strawberry milkshake." Clara's eyes lit up, and she looked at Henry with a pleading gaze that could melt glaciers. He caved instantly. "1 strawberry milkshake coming up." As he flagged down a passing waitress to order, he watched Ilara. She wasn't looking at him. She was leaning over the table, genuinely listening as Clara explained the complex social hierarchy of her second-grade class. She didn't look bored or impatient. She looked present. When the milkshake arrived, a towering pink concoction with whipped cream and a cherry, Ilara helped Clara adjust her napkin to prevent any spills. It was a small, maternal gesture, so natural and unthinking that it made Henry's breath catch in his throat. It was something Sarah would have done. He pushed the thought away, focusing on the here and now. So, Clara's told you all my secrets. What about you, the waitress? Ilara looked up from watching Clara, a faint blush on her cheeks. Oh, yeah. I work over at the Daily Grind, downtown. That's a busy place. Must be tough, Henry said, making conversation. It has its moments, she replied, her gaze drifting toward the window for a second. Long hours. You meet a lot of interesting people. But it pays the bills. There was a weariness in her voice that seemed to go beyond just tired feet. It sounded like a deeper kind of exhaustion, one he recognized. I know what you mean, he found himself saying. The night shift at Blackwood Tower is quiet, but it's a different kind of tired. You feel like you're living in a different world from everyone else. Her eyes snapped back to his, a flicker of something, surprise, recognition, in them. Blackwood Tower? You work for Orion Blackwood. Well, I work in his building. I doubt Mr. Blackwood knows my name, Henry said with a small chuckle. I just push a mop on the 50th floor. He's up on the 60th, in the penthouse. Might as well be on the moon. Ilara just nodded slowly, stirring her coffee without drinking it. Right. The moon. She was a good listener. He found himself talking more than he had to anyone besides Clara in years. He talked about his job, the strange peace of walking through empty, silent offices high above the sleeping city. He talked about Clara's love for science, her rock collection, her dream of one day seeing a real volcano. He didn't talk about Sarah, not by name, but she was there in the spaces between his words, in the careful way he described his life as a party of two. And Ilara listened. She listened with an intensity that made him feel, for the first time in a very long time, seen. When she did speak, it was to ask thoughtful questions, her shyness seeming to melt away the more he talked. By the time Clara had systematically demolished her milkshake and was starting to yawn, the sun had begun to set, painting the diner in a warm, orange glow. The nervous tension that had coiled in Henry's gut hours ago had vanished, replaced by a quiet, unfamiliar warmth. I should probably get this one home, he said, motioning to Clara, who was now leaning her head on his arm. Of course, Ilara said, her smile soft. They stood outside on the pavement, the evening air cool against their faces. The silence returned, but this time it was comfortable, filled with unspoken possibility. I had a really nice time, Ilara, Henry said, and was surprised to find he meant it with every fiber of his being. Me too, she said, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket. She looked at Clara, who was now half asleep on her feet. It was a pleasure to meet such a talented dinosaur artist. He chuckled. Well, if you ever need a purple stegosaurus, you know who to call. It was a clumsy attempt at a joke, but she smiled, a real bright smile that lit up her whole face. And in that moment, Henry felt it. A flicker. A tiny, fragile spark in a part of his heart he thought had gone cold forever. This wasn't a mistake. Not at all. This felt, impossibly, like a beginning. Henry tucked the unicorn-themed blanket under Clara's chin, the small nightlight on her bedside table casting a soft glow on her sleeping face. She had fallen asleep in the car on the way home from the diner, a faint smile on her lips, and hadn't even stirred when he carried her inside. Before her eyes had drifted shut, she delivered her official verdict in a sleepy whisper. She's nice, Daddy. Her smile is real, not like the pretend ones on TV. He smoothed her hair back from her forehead, his heart aching with a familiar mix of love and sorrow. A real smile. It was the kind of simple, profound observation only a child could make. It was also true. Ilara's smile wasn't a performance. Nothing about her had felt like a performance. Downstairs, the silence of their small apartment seemed less heavy than usual. Henry made a sandwich he didn't feel like eating and checked the clock. He had an hour before he needed to leave for his shift. As he pulled on the simple gray uniform of the Blackwood Industries maintenance staff, he caught his reflection in the hallway mirror. He saw tired eyes, a face that was starting to show the last 5 years of single parenthood and sleepless nights, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than exhaustion. It was hope, and it terrified him. Loving Sarah had been as easy as breathing. Losing her had been like learning to live without air. He'd spent 5 years building walls around his heart, not out of bitterness, but for protection. His world had shrunk to a manageable size. Clara. That was it. That was enough. Inviting someone else in, even for coffee, felt like a betrayal of that quiet, sad peace. It felt like a risk he had no right to take. But then he remembered Alara kneeling to talk to Clara about a purple dinosaur, and the fear ebbed, replaced by that same quiet warmth from the diner. Miles away, in a part of the city Henry only ever saw from the 50th floor windows of his workplace, Alara stepped out of a taxi. She didn't walk into a modest apartment building. She used a key card to enter a private elevator that opened directly into a sprawling penthouse. The space was a monument to minimalist luxury, all glass, steel, and polished concrete, with a view that swallowed the entire city skyline. Her father, Orion Blackwood, was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of water in his hand. He was a man who seemed to be carved from the same stone as his buildings, imposing, sharp-edged, and unyielding. He didn't turn as she entered. "You're late," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight of command. "The diner was busy," Alara replied, slipping off her worn sneakers and leaving them by the door, a small, scruffy rebellion in the immaculate space. She walked over to the marble kitchen island and poured herself a glass of water, her movements weary. "And," Orion turned, his eyes sharp and analytical, "did you hear anything? Any new whispers about Adler?" Alara shook her head. "Nothing. Just the usual complaints about the new coffee supplier and gossip about the marketing department. Garrick Adler's name didn't come up once." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "Dad, I've been serving coffee for 3 weeks. The most I've learned is that half the accounting department is cheating on their diet." "Patience, Alara," he said, his tone softening only slightly. "Adler is smart. He's been siphoning money from the logistics and procurement budgets for over a year, I'm sure of it. But his books are pristine. The auditors found nothing. The leak has to be on the inside, a junior partner, an assistant, someone he talks to, someone who might get careless with a coffee and a sympathetic ear. And you're sure I'm the right person for this?" she asked, the question hanging in the air between them. It was a conversation they'd had a dozen times. "You're the only person I can trust," he stated, as if it were an undeniable law of physics. "You have my eyes and your mother's intuition. You see things other people miss." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "Find me a name, a company, a bank account. Find me one loose thread, and I will unravel his entire career." Alara just nodded, the weight of his expectations settling over her. She thought of the diner, of the easy conversation, of a man with kind, sad eyes and a daughter who believed in purple dinosaurs. That was a world away from this one, a world of secrets and suspicion. She felt a pang of guilt, a feeling that was becoming increasingly familiar. She was using that world, mining it for information. It didn't feel right. Henry pushed his wheeled trash receptacle through the silent, cavernous halls of Blackwood Industries. The 50th floor housed the company's top legal and financial executives. By day, it was a hive of high-stakes energy. By night, it was his domain, a quiet, orderly tomb of empty desks and sleeping computer screens. He usually liked the anonymity, the feeling of being a ghost moving through the lives of powerful people. Tonight, however, the place felt different. It felt connected to the Shy Waitress with a warm smile. He reached the corner suite of offices belonging to Garrick Adler, the company's chief operating officer. The man was known for his demanding nature and his immaculate, intimidating office, As Henry emptied the wastebaskets, his practiced movements automatic, he noticed something amiss. The shredder next to Adler's desk was overflowing, and a few stray strips of paper had missed the bin, clinging to the carpet by static electricity. He bent down to pick them up, his movements tidy and efficient. It was his job to leave no trace. But as he gathered the thin ribbons of paper, a single strip caught his eye. Unlike the others, which were covered in dense lines of text, this one had only a few words on it, part of a larger document. He could make out a fragment of a logo he didn't recognize, the word Cayman, and a series of numbers that looked like part of a bank transfer code. Henry paused, the strip of paper resting in his palm. It was probably nothing. Junk mail, an old travel document. But something about it felt deliberate. Adler was a meticulous man. Careless was not a word anyone would associate with him. A strange instinct. A quiet alarm bell honed by years of noticing things that were out of place. A scuff mark that wasn't there yesterday. A chair moved an inch to the left, told him to hold on to it. He slipped the small paper ribbon into the pocket of his uniform, flattened the empty trash bag, and moved on, the metallic squeak of his cart's wheels echoing in the silence. The mystery of the paper was a small, intriguing puzzle in the predictable landscape of his night. Later, during his 3 a.m. break in the deserted employee cafeteria, he pulled out his phone. His heart did a nervous little flip-flop. He scrolled to his recent calls, to the number his neighbor had given him. He typed out a message, his thumb hovering over the send button. "Hey, Alara, it's Henry. I just wanted to say again that I had a really great time tonight." He read it over. It sounded stiff. He deleted it. "Hi, Henry here. Hope you got home okay. I had fun too casual?" He groaned, feeling like a teenager again. He was overthinking this. He typed one more time. "Henry Callahan, the guy with the purple dinosaur expert. I hope this isn't too forward, but I was wondering if you might be free to get another coffee sometime. Without my chaperone this time, I promise." He held his breath and pressed send. He put the phone face down on the table, his heart thumping. Maybe she wouldn't answer. Maybe she'd been polite and he'd misread everything. A minute passed, then 2. His phone buzzed against the tabletop. He flipped it over. A message from Alara. "I'd love that. And for the record, your chaperone is welcome any time." Henry leaned back in his chair, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face, the first of its kind in a long, long time. In his pocket, the slip of shredded paper felt like a forgotten secret. For now, it was eclipsed by the bright, shining possibility of a second date. Their second date was a Saturday afternoon, bathed in the crisp, golden light of early autumn. They met at the entrance to Glenwood Park, a place Henry often took Clara to hunt for interesting leaves and chase squirrels. This time, it was just the two of them, and the quiet felt both strange and wonderful. Alara was wearing a soft, oversized blue sweater that made her look even more gentle than he remembered. "No chaperone today?" she asked, a playful glint in her eyes. "She's at Mrs. Gable's, learning the ancient and secret art of baking gingerbread men," Henry said with a smile. "She drove a hard bargain. I had to promise her 2 extra bedtime stories and a trip to the Science Museum. Sounds like you have a skilled negotiator on your hands." "You have no idea," he laughed. As they walked along the winding path, leaves crunching under their feet, the conversation from the diner picked up as if it had never stopped. The nervousness of the first date had melted away, replaced by a comfortable ease. Henry found himself telling her about Sarah, something he rarely did with anyone. He spoke not of the tragedy of her death, but of the small, happy memories. The way she used to sing off-key while cooking, her terrible sense of direction, the way she had looked at him the day Clara was born. "It's hard to imagine letting someone else in," he admitted, his voice quiet as he stared at a passing couple pushing a stroller. "It feels disloyal sometimes." Like I'd be breaking a promise, Alara was silent for a long moment, just walking beside him. When she finally spoke, her words were careful and full of an empathy that felt profound. "I don't think you can break a promise to a memory, Henry. Maybe you just learn to make new ones. It doesn't mean the old ones are any less beautiful." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and felt a wave of gratitude. She wasn't trying to fix him or give him cheap platitudes. She was just listening, understanding. "What about you?" he asked, wanting to shift the focus away from his own past. "You said you work a lot. Not much time for, well, for this?" A shadow seemed to pass over her features, so fleeting he almost missed it. "No, not much time," she said, her gaze fixed on the path ahead. "My job is demanding. It takes up a lot of space in my head." She offered a small, self-deprecating smile. "Most of my excitement involves trying to guess who's going to order the daily special." Henry chuckled, but he could sense there was more to it. He decided not to press. If she could give him the space to hold on to his past, he could give her the space to hold on to her present. "It must be interesting, though, working at a place like Blackwood Tower," she said, her tone casual. But he noticed her eyes were watching him intently. "You must see all the big shots coming and going." "Not really. My shift starts after they've all gone home. It's just me, the security guards, and the ghosts," he said. "You get a sense of people from what they leave behind, though. Some offices are messy, some are obsessively neat. You can tell who's stressed and who's coasting." "What about the man in charge?" "Orion Blackwood?" she asked. "Never seen him. His office is like a fortress. But the whole company runs on his reputation. He's tough, demanding, but supposedly fair. At least that's the company line Henry kicked at a loose stone. Lately, though, things feel different. There are whispers about budget freezes, projects getting delayed. People are on edge, especially around guys like Garrick Adler. Ilara's voice was perfectly neutral, but Henry saw her hands clench slightly at her sides. "He's the COO, a real shark, from what I hear. His team is always the last to leave. You can feel the tension on his floor. It's a different kind of quiet up there, a heavier one." As he spoke, Ilara's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her expression tightening as she glanced at the screen. He caught a glimpse of the name before she quickly angled it away. "Father." She silenced the call and shoved the phone back into her pocket, a flush rising on her cheeks. "Sorry," she mumbled. "Probably just a work thing." But the easy rhythm of their conversation had been broken. The wall of her shyness seemed to go back up, brick by invisible brick. The rest of the walk was pleasant, but laced with a new, unspoken tension. He felt like he'd said something wrong, crossed a line he hadn't known was there. Meanwhile, on the 58th floor of Blackwood Tower, Garrick Adler slammed his office phone down into its cradle, his face a mask of controlled fury. "I don't care what it takes," he hissed into the empty room. "The internal audit is starting next week. I want every file triple-checked. Any loose ends, you bury them. You understand me? You bury them deep." He paced the length of his vast office, his expensive shoes silent on the plush carpet. He stopped and stared out the window, his gaze sweeping over the city below. He had a distinct, unnerving feeling that he was being watched. He couldn't prove it, but the hairs on the back of his neck had been prickling for weeks. The old man was sniffing around. He was sure of it. He had to find a way to direct that suspicion elsewhere. He needed a distraction, a scapegoat. Henry walked Ilara to the bus stop as the afternoon light began to fade. The awkwardness from the park lingered between them. He didn't want the day to end like this, on a note of confusion. "Hey," he said, just as the bus pulled up to the curb. "Did I say something wrong back there?" She looked up at him, her eyes wide and conflicted. For a second, he thought she was going to tell him something real, something important. But then her expression smoothed over, the mask of the shy waitress sliding back into place. "No, not at all," she said, her voice a little too bright. I get stressed about work sometimes. It's nothing." She gave him that same small, sad smile he was beginning to recognize. "I had a really wonderful time, Henry." She turned to step onto the bus. Acting on an impulse he didn't fully understand, he reached out and gently took her hand. "Ilara, wait." She stopped, her hand resting in his. Her skin was soft, and a jolt of warmth shot up his arm. Her eyes met his, and in them, He saw a maelstrom of emotions she was trying desperately to hide. "Let's do this again soon," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She searched his face for a long moment, as if looking for something she was afraid to find. Then she nodded. A single, almost imperceptible movement. "I'd like that." She pulled her hand away, climbed onto the bus, and didn't look back. As the bus pulled away from the curb, Henry stood on the sidewalk, the phantom warmth of her hand still tingling in his. He felt more hopeful than he had in 5 years, and more confused than he'd ever been in his life. He was sure of only one thing. There was a story behind Alara's sad eyes, and he wanted, more than anything, to know what it was. The bus rattled through the city streets, but Alara was oblivious to the blur of lights outside the window. She sat with her hands clenched in her lap, her mind replaying every moment of the afternoon. The warmth in Henry's voice when he spoke about his daughter. The profound, unguarded sadness in his eyes when he mentioned his late wife. The simple, shocking warmth of his hand holding hers. Every genuine word he'd spoken felt like a hot coal against her conscience. She had gone on this date, and the one before, under a false identity with a hidden agenda. But the mission was becoming clouded. The man she was supposed to be observing, the janitor who was her key to the company's underbelly, was becoming Henry. Just Henry. A kind, decent man who had been through more than his share of heartbreak and was cautiously, bravely, trying to let a little light back into his life. And she was the one holding the curtain, pretending it wasn't made of lies. When she arrived back at the penthouse, Orion was in his study, a stark room with a single, massive oak desk and a wall of books. He didn't look up from the tablet he was reading. "Anything?" he asked, his voice sharp. "I saw him again," Alara said, remaining by the door. She didn't specify who. She didn't have to. "The janitor." And what pearls of wisdom did he have to offer this time? The condescension in his voice made her bristle. "He said there's a heavy atmosphere on the 58th floor, that people are on edge around Garrick Adler. He says you can feel the tension." Orion finally looked up, a flicker of interest in his eyes. Tension is good. It means Adler feels the pressure. He's getting sloppy. He waved a dismissive hand. "Fine. It's a crumb, but it's something. Keep meeting with him." "It feels wrong, Dad," she burst out, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "He's a good person. He's just trying to live his life. I feel like I'm using him." Orion's gaze hardened. "You are using him." "That is the entire point of the exercise, Alara. This isn't about making friends. This is about protecting the legacy I have spent 40 years building, a legacy that will one day be yours. Do not let sentimentality compromise the mission." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You're not getting attached to this man, are you?" "Of course not," she lied, her voice coming out a little too quickly. "I'm just saying, there has to be another way." "There isn't," he said, his tone final as he looked back down at his tablet, the conversation officially over. "Find me proof." Alara retreated, her heart pounding. Her father had seen it. He had seen the crack in her composure, the mission, her feelings for Henry, her duty to her father. They were all on a collision course, and she was standing right in the middle of the tracks. The next evening, Henry sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by construction paper, cotton balls, and glitter. He and Clara were building a diorama of the solar system for her science class. "Dad, does Jupiter have rings?" Clara asked, carefully gluing a styrofoam ball to a piece of black cardboard. "It does," Henry said, smiling. "They're just very faint. Not show-offs like Saturn's. Saturn is a show-off." Clara giggled, shaking a cascade of silver glitter onto her project. This was his life. This simple, glitter-dusted chaos. This was his safe harbor. And the thought of Alara, of the complicated feelings she stirred in him, felt like a ship sailing toward it from a distant, unknown ocean. He wasn't sure if it was a friendly vessel or a pirate ship. Later that night, after tucking Clara into bed, he sat at his small desk before work, the apartment quiet again. He pulled the shredded strip of paper from his wallet and stared at it. Cayman. An island. A bank, probably. It was none of his business. He should throw it away. But his mind kept replaying Alara's questions. What are the big bosses like? Adler. He opened his laptop. He wasn't a hacker or a detective, but he knew how to search. He typed in the fragment of the company name he could make out. Vertex Holdings. The first few results were for a construction company in Ohio and a tech firm in California. Dead ends, but he kept digging, adding the word Cayman to the search. Deep in the search results, on the 5th page, he found it. A single mention in an old, obscure financial news forum. Someone had posted a question years ago about Vertex Holdings, asking if anyone knew who was behind it. The only reply was cryptic, a ghost. A shell for moving money where prying eyes can't see it. It wasn't proof of anything, but it sent a chill down his spine. This was something real, something hidden. What did it have to do with a man as powerful as Garrick Adler? In his office, Garrick Adler was also at his computer. But he wasn't searching. He was directing. He was on a secure call with a contact in the IT department, a man whose loyalty he had purchased years ago. I want you to run a full background audit on the entire night maintenance staff, Adler commanded, his voice a low murmur. I need to know everything. Credit scores, debts, past employers. Look for weaknesses. Look for anyone who seems desperate. And I want you to start mirroring their network access logs. I want to know every keystroke they make on a company terminal. Sir, that's highly irregular, the IT contact said nervously. I'd need a compelling reason to authorize that level of surveillance. The reason, Adler said, his voice turning to ice, is that I have a credible security threat, and if you question my authority on this again, you will be spending your time auditing the unemployment website. Am I clear? Yes, sir. Crystal clear. Adler hung up and leaned back, a thin, cruel smile on his lips. The pieces were moving. He just needed to find the right pawn to place on the board. Henry closed his laptop, the words from the forum echoing in his mind. He felt like he had stumbled into a dark room and had no idea where the walls were. He was just a janitor. This was way above his pay grade. His phone buzzed on the desk beside him. He picked it up, expecting a message from Mrs. Gable about Clara. But the name on the screen made his heart skip a beat. It was Alara. I know this is last minute, but there's a street fair downtown this weekend. Music, food trucks, all that. I was wondering if you and a certain dinosaur expert would want to go. He stared at the message, the warmth of it a stark contrast to the cold mystery on his computer screen. Her invitation was an anchor to the simple, hopeful world he wanted to live in. It was a world of street fairs and shared laughter, not shell companies and secret codes. He didn't hesitate. We'd love to. Name the time and place. Clara will want to inspect the structural integrity of the bouncy castle. Her reply was almost instantaneous. A string of laughing emojis followed by, it's a date. He smiled, a real smile, and for a moment, he forgot all about Garrick Adler and the darkness he represented. He had a date, a real date, with a woman who made him feel, impossibly, like himself again. The street fair was a kaleidoscope of life, a chaotic, joyful symphony of sound and color. Music from a live band mingled with the laughter of children and the sizzle of food trucks. The air was thick with the sweet scent of cotton candy and popcorn. For Henry, who spent most of his waking hours in the quiet worlds of his apartment or the empty 50th floor, the vibrant energy was almost overwhelming. For Clara, it was pure magic. She darted between them, a small whirlwind of excitement, her hand alternating between Henry's and Alara's. She dragged them to a booth where they tossed rings at glass bottles, and with Alara's surprisingly steady aim guiding her, Clara won a ridiculously large, rainbow-colored stuffed unicorn. She named it Sparklehoof on the spot and insisted Alara carry it, as she was the champion ring tosser. Alara accepted the honor with a mock-serious expression, cradling the giant unicorn as if it were a priceless trophy. Henry watched them, a feeling swelling in his chest that was so warm and full it almost hurt. He saw Alara wipe a smudge of chocolate from Clara's cheek with her thumb. He saw her listen with rapt attention as Clara explained the physics of the bouncy castle. He saw the way she looked at his daughter, not with the polite tolerance of a stranger, but with a genuine, unreserved affection that made his own heart ache with a hope he had long since buried. They found a small patch of grass to sit on and eat, spreading a napkin over the ground. Henry watched as Ilara, without a word, broke her hot dog in half and gave the larger piece to Clara when she declared she was still hungry. It was a small, simple act, but it spoke volumes. "I haven't seen her this happy in a long time," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. He looked from Clara, who was now trying to feed a piece of her bun to Sparklehoof, to Ilara. I haven't felt this normal in years. Thank you, Ilara." Her smile was fragile, a beautiful, heartbreaking thing. "You deserve to be happy, Henry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You both do." She looked away toward the laughing crowds, but he could see the conflict raging in her eyes. He had offered her a piece of his heart, a glimpse into his quiet, fragile world. And she knew, with a certainty that made her sick to her stomach, that her very presence in it was a lie. A few yards away, a man stood in line for lemonade, his own young son tugging at his jacket. His name was Jennings, and he was the head of internal security for Garrick Adler's division at Blackwood Industries. He was off the clock, but his eyes, trained to notice details, were always working. His gaze swept the crowd and landed on a familiar face, Henry Callahan, one of the janitors on the list Adler had given him to investigate. Jennings watched as Callahan laughed, leaning close to a woman Jennings didn't recognize. The janitor looked happy, relaxed. The woman was holding a giant stuffed unicorn and smiling at the little girl, a perfect picture of a happy family. Jennings's mind, conditioned by Adler's paranoia, immediately processed this through a lens of suspicion. He discreetly pulled out his phone, angled it, and took a quick, clear photo of the three of them sitting on the grass. He would show it to Adler on Monday. Every piece of information was valuable. Every connection was a potential weakness. The sun began to dip below the city buildings, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The lights of the fair flickered on, casting a magical glow over the dwindling crowds. Clara was finally starting to run out of steam, her head resting sleepily on Ilara's lap as they sat on a bench listening to the band play a soft, slow song. It was time to go. Henry gently lifted a sleeping Clara into his arms, her head nestling into the familiar crook of his neck. Sparklehoof the unicorn was tucked under his other arm. Ilara walked beside them, a quiet, shared intimacy settling between them as they made their way out of the fairgrounds. He walked her to the bus stop, the same one as last time. The street was quieter now, the sounds of the fair a distant, happy murmur. Today was, he started, struggling to find the right word. It was perfect. Yes, she agreed softly, her gaze on the pavement. It was. The bus was still a few minutes away. He shifted Clara's weight in his arms. He should say goodnight. He should let her go. But he couldn't. Every instinct, every lonely part of him that had been dormant for 5 years, was screaming at him not to let this moment end. "Ilara," he said, his voice low. She looked up, and in the dim glow of the streetlight, he could see the vulnerability in her eyes. He leaned in, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. Her eyes fluttered closed, and he pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was everything he hadn't let himself hope for. It was hesitant at first, then deepened with a gentle, searching warmth that felt like coming home. It wasn't a kiss of wild passion, but of profound, aching tenderness. It was a kiss that spoke of lonely nights and quiet hopes, of two fractured souls finding a moment of perfect, shared peace. When he pulled back, her eyes were shining. She touched her lips, a look of wonder on her face. The bus arrived with a hiss of its brakes, breaking the spell. I'll text you," she whispered, her voice shaky. "Okay," was all he could manage. She climbed onto the bus, and this time, just before the doors closed, she looked back at him, her expression a whirlwind of joy and sorrow. He stood on the sidewalk, holding his sleeping daughter, and watched until the bus was just a pair of red lights disappearing into the night. On the bus, Ilara sank into a seat at the back, pressing her fingers to her lips. She could still feel the warmth of his kiss, a feeling so real and beautiful it made her want to weep. For a few perfect hours, she had forgotten who she was. She wasn't Ilara Blackwood, the billionaire's daughter on a secret mission. She was just Ilara, a woman falling for a kind, gentle man and his wonderful daughter. But the kiss had changed everything. It had solidified the lie, turning it from a simple deception into a profound betrayal. The joy of the moment was already being consumed by the terrifying, suffocating weight of the truth. This was no longer a mission. It was her life. And it was built on a foundation that was about to crumble. The night after the street fair, the 50th floor of Blackwood Tower felt different. The silence that had once been a source of comfort for Henry now seemed to hum with a quiet energy. As he polished the vast reflective floors, he didn't see the tired janitor from a few days ago. He saw a man who had held a woman's hand, a man who had kissed her under a streetlight and felt the world shift on its axis. He was floating, buoyed by a feeling so light and unfamiliar, it felt like a dream. Every polished surface seemed to reflect Ilara's smile. For Ilara, the night was anything but a dream. She lay awake in her cavernous, silent bedroom, the memory of the kiss a burning ember in her mind. It had been real, more real than the silk sheets she was tangled in, more real than the name Blackwood that defined her entire existence. The pure, simple honesty of that moment made the complexity of her lie feel like a physical weight pressing down on her, suffocating her. She couldn't face her father. She couldn't bear to see the mission in his eyes, when all she could see was Henry's face. On Monday morning, Jennings laid a thin file on Garrick Adler's expansive desk. "Henry Callahan," Jennings announced, his voice flat. "Night janitor, 50th to 50th, 5th floors. Widower. One daughter, age 7. No criminal record. Finances are tight but stable. No red flags for gambling or substance abuse." He's clean. Adler flipped through the file, his expression one of disdain. "Clean men don't embezzle, Jennings. They don't have the imagination." "What else?" Jennings placed his phone on the desk and swiped to the photo he had taken at the street fair. He was out with his daughter this weekend, and this woman Adler leaned in, studying the image of Henry and Ilara laughing on the grass. He didn't recognize her. She was nobody. But he saw the way the janitor was looking at her. He saw a weakness. "Find out who she is," Adler commanded. "I want her name, her job, where she lives." A man with a clean record and a tight budget suddenly has a new girlfriend. Find out if she's expensive. People do stupid things for love, or for money that buys love that evening. The tension at the Blackwood dinner table was thick enough to cut with a knife. Orion ate his perfectly prepared meal with a focused intensity, while Ilara pushed her food around her plate. "It has been over a month," Orion said, finally breaking the silence. His voice was dangerously soft. "The board is getting restless." The whispers about Adler's creative accounting are growing louder, but without proof. They are just whispers. "All you have given me is the gossip of a janitor." "He's not just a janitor," Ilara snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. "He's observant and intelligent." Orion set his fork down with a precise click. He stared at his daughter, his eyes narrowing into analytical slits. "You have seen him 4 times, Ilara. You speak of him with a familiarity, a defensiveness. This was a tactical operation, not a social experiment. I need you to remember that I remember," she said, her gaze dropping to her plate. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. "Good," he said curtly. "Because men like that, simple, working-class men, they have their place. It is not alongside a Blackwood. Do your job, get the information, and end it." His words were a dismissal, not just of Henry, but of her feelings. It was a cold, calculated reminder of the world she belonged to, and the man she was growing to love who would never be welcome in it. Later that night, the weight of her father's words still heavy on his mind, Henry was clearing the recycling from a small, private conference room adjacent to Adler's office. A late-night meeting had just concluded. As he consolidated the half-empty coffee cups and discarded papers, he noticed a cocktail napkin, crumpled into a ball. He was about to toss it into the bag when he saw the ink. His movement slowed. He carefully uncrumpled the napkin. Scribbled in hurried, sharp handwriting were a few notes. A date from the previous week, a series of numbers that looked like a routing code, and a single, stark word that made his blood run cold. Vertex. It was the same name from the shredded paper, the same name from the Financial Forum. He was now holding a second piece of the puzzle, a direct physical link between Adler and the mysterious Cayman Shell Company. He smoothed the napkin out and folded it carefully, his hands trembling slightly. He tucked it into the same pocket where he'd put the first strip of paper. This was no longer a coincidence. This was a pattern. During his break, he saw Sal, the veteran night shift security guard, doing his rounds. Sal was a man in his late 60s with kind eyes and an air of quiet authority. He'd worked in the building for 30 years. "Hey, Sal," Henry began, trying to sound casual. "You ever see anything weird on the executive floors?" After hours, Sal took a slow sip from his thermos, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He looked at Henry for a long, appraising moment. "Weird how, kid? I don't know. Meetings that aren't on the schedule? Visitors who don't sign in?" Sal screwed the cap back on his thermos. "Let me give you a piece of free advice, Henry. You're a good man. You do your job, you go home to that little girl of yours. That's your world. Up here," he gestured vaguely toward the ceiling, toward the floors above. "This is a different world. It runs on different rules. The things you and I call weird, they call business. The best thing you can do for yourself and for your daughter is to see nothing. You hear nothing. It's safer that way." The advice was meant to be kind, but it landed like a threat. Sal had seen things. He knew. Henry finished his shift as the first gray light of dawn was breaking over the city. He walked home through the waking streets, his mind a battlefield. In one world, there was Ilara, her smile, her kiss, the promise of a simple, shared happiness. In another, there was this dark, unfolding secret, a crumpled napkin, a ghost company, and a silent warning from a man who knew better. He was standing at a crossroads he never wanted to find. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. A message from Ilara. "Still thinking about yesterday. I can't stop smiling." He stared at the screen, the warmth of her words a stark contrast to the cold, crumpled napkin in his pocket. The two worlds had just collided, and he knew, with a sinking feeling of dread, that he couldn't protect one without betraying the other. The lie was no longer a simple weight. It was a living, breathing thing that sat on Ilara's chest, making it hard to breathe. The joy she felt with Henry was immediately followed by a wave of nauseating guilt. Her father's cold, pragmatic words echoed in her ears. "Do your job, get the information, and end it." But how could she end something that felt like the only real thing in her life? She realized, with a terrifying clarity, that the only way out was forward. She couldn't keep waiting for clues to fall into her lap at the diner. She had to get closer to the source. She had to get inside Blackwood Tower. A few days later, she was standing behind the gleaming chrome counter of The Peak, the exclusive coffee bar on the 55th floor of the Blackwood building. Armed with a skillfully forged resume and the benefit of a high turnover rate for service staff, she had secured a trial run as a barista. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she fumbled with the steam wand of the espresso machine. From here, she could see the private elevators that led to the executive suites. She was in the lion's den, disguised as a mouse. While Ilara was starting her new high-risk job, Jennings was reporting his failures to Garrick Adler. "She's a ghost," Jennings said, standing stiffly before Adler's desk. "The waitress, the one Callahan was with. The diner he mentioned. The Daily Grind? No one named Ilara has ever worked there. We've run facial recognition against every database we have access to. Nothing. No credit cards, no driver's license, no social media presence under that name. She doesn't exist." Adler leaned forward, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "Oh, she exists. People don't just appear out of thin air. This is better than I thought. Our clean, simple janitor isn't so simple after all. He's involved with a woman who lives completely off the grid. It paints a very interesting picture, doesn't it? A man with money problems and a girlfriend with no official identity. Keep digging. The fact that the woman was a mystery made Henry an even more perfect scapegoat. It suggested a conspiracy, a partner in crime. Henry, meanwhile, felt trapped. Sal's warning had shaken him. See nothing, hear nothing. But he had seen something. He had 2 pieces of a dangerous puzzle sitting in a small box in his sock drawer. Every time he looked at Clara, he felt a surge of protective fear. What if this secret put her in danger? He couldn't go to the police. His evidence was flimsy at best, a scrap of paper and a napkin. He couldn't go to company security. They answered to men like Adler. He came to one terrifying conclusion. He had to get the evidence to the only person in the building with the power to act on it. The only person Adler truly feared. He had to get it to Orion Blackwood. The question was how. The 60th floor was a fortress, accessible only by a private, key-card-operated elevator. No janitor, no mail courier, no one got up there without express clearance. His first day behind the counter, Ilara's nerves were stretched to their breaking point. She served dozens of people, all of them wearing the sharp, expensive suits of the corporate elite. She kept her head down, her hands busy, her ears open. Around noon, a hush fell over the small cafe. Garrick Adler approached the counter, barking his order for a quadruple-shot espresso into his phone without making eye contact. Ilara's hands trembled as she worked the machine, her back turned to him. She placed the cup on the counter and he swept it up, still deep in his phone call, and walked away. He hadn't even seen her. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Just as her heart rate was returning to normal, she heard a sound that froze her blood. The soft, authoritative chime of the private elevator. The doors slid open, and her father, Orion Blackwood, stepped out, flanked by 2 imposing bodyguards. He was heading for the main boardroom on this floor. He was walking directly toward her counter. Panic seized her. She spun around, pretending to be intensely focused on wiping down the espresso machine, her back to the room. She could hear his footsteps on the marble floor, closer, closer. She could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne. It was the scent of her entire childhood. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying he wouldn't decide today was the day he developed a craving for a latte. He walked past without a word, his voice a low, commanding rumble as he spoke to one of his guards. The footsteps receded. The private elevator chimed again as it was called back to the 60th floor. She sagged against the counter, her legs feeling weak. It had been less than 10 seconds, but it had felt like an eternity. The risk she was taking was no longer theoretical. It was real, and it was terrifying. That night, her phone call with Henry was a lifeline. His calm, steady voice was an anchor in the storm of her day. Clara finally finished her solar system, he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. There's more glitter on my floor than there is in the known universe, but Jupiter has never looked better. She laughed, the sound genuine and relieved. I'm sure it's a masterpiece. The conversation flowed easily, a welcome escape for both of them. He didn't mention the napkin, and she didn't mention serving coffee to her own father's nemesis. But the secrets were there, a silent weight beneath the surface of their happy words. Henry, feeling the need for some kind of reassurance, decided to take a small risk. You know, he started, his tone thoughtful. The owner, Orion Blackwood. He has this reputation for being a monster, but I don't know. I get the feeling he's a decent man underneath it all. I feel like if he knew something really wrong was happening in his company, he'd want to fix it. The question hung in the air, a direct, innocent strike at the heart of her deception. Ilara's throat went dry. She looked around the luxurious penthouse her father provided, a gilded cage built on his ruthless principles. A decent man. It was more complicated than that. But what could she say? I'm sure you're right, she said, the words feeling like a betrayal on every level. A man like that wouldn't have built something so successful without some kind of integrity. Yeah, Henry said, his voice sounding lighter, validated. That's what I think too. After they hung up, Henry stood in his small, quiet apartment, a new resolve hardening within him. Her words had been the final push he needed. He wasn't being paranoid. He was doing the right thing. He walked to his bedroom, pulled the small box from his sock drawer, and looked at the two flimsy pieces of evidence inside. The shredded strip. The crumpled napkin. It wasn't much, but it was the truth. He had to get it to the 60th floor. He began to formulate a plan, a risky, desperate idea that involved the one thing he had that no executive did, a key to every service corridor in the building. He was going to the moon. The night began like any other. Henry clocked in, gathered his supplies, and started his rounds on the 50th floor. But tonight, a current of nervous energy coursed through him, making his movements sharp and his senses heightened. Tucked inside a plain manila envelope in his inner jacket pocket were the two small pieces of paper. They felt impossibly heavy, like the weight of his entire future had been condensed into a few square inches of paper and ink. His plan was simple, but the risks were enormous. At 2 a.m., during the shift change for the main security guards, there was a 7-minute window where the service elevators were less monitored. That was his chance. Down on the 55th floor, Ilara was serving the last of the late-working executives from her coffee counter. Her nerves were frayed from the close call with her father, and her guilt over Henry was a constant, dull ache. As she was wiping down the counter, she overheard two lawyers from the Mergers and Acquisitions Department talking in low, urgent tones. "Can't believe Adler is going to throw one of the night guys under the bus," the first one said, stirring his coffee with a vicious energy. "He's got to," the second replied, looking around nervously. "The board is breathing down his neck. He needs to serve up a head on a platter. Some poor janitor is the perfect patsy. Who's going to believe him?" The word janitor struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't just a possibility anymore. It was happening. They were coming for Henry. She had to warn him. She ripped off her apron, ignoring the confused look from her manager. "Family emergency," she mumbled, and ran, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. At precisely 2:03 a.m., Henry slipped into a service corridor. The air immediately changed, becoming thick with the smell of dust and the low, mechanical hum of the building's hidden heart. He navigated the labyrinthine passages with a practiced ease, his soft-soled shoes making no sound on the concrete floor. He took a rattling service elevator, the kind meant for hauling equipment, up to the 59th floor. He was breaking a dozen protocols. If Sal or any other guard caught him, he'd be fired on the spot. But the thought of Clara's future propelled him forward. Ilara was in a state of pure panic. She tried calling Henry's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. He always turned it off during his shift. She raced to the 50th floor, her heels clicking frantically on the marble. She found his cleaning cart parked neatly by a set of offices, a half-empty spray bottle of glass cleaner sitting on top. But Henry was gone. A cold dread washed over her. Where was he? Had they already taken him? Henry found the final maintenance access door, its handle cold and solid in his hand. He stepped out into a small, sterile hallway, lined with brushed steel panels. This was the executive service corridor. At the far end was a narrow, unassuming slot in the wall, labeled simply, OB Private Delivery. He pulled the envelope from his pocket. His hands were shaking, but his purpose was clear. He slid the envelope into the slot. It disappeared with a soft thud. Relief, profound and absolute, washed over him. He had done it. The secret was no longer his to carry. He made his way back down, the journey feeling lighter, faster. He stepped out of a service door onto the 58th floor, intending to take the main staff elevator the rest of the way. And then he saw her. Ilara was standing at the far end of the deserted corridor, her face pale with panic. She had been searching every floor. Their eyes locked across the vast, silent expanse. And in that same, heart-stopping moment, the doors of the private elevator slid open behind her. Orion Blackwood stepped out, flanked by his two bodyguards. He had been alerted by his head of security to an unauthorized override on a service elevator leading to the executive floors. He had come to see for himself who was bold enough to trespass in his domain. He saw his daughter first, her presence in a secure hallway in the middle of the night, a shocking, inexplicable anomaly. Then he followed her gaze to the man in the janitor's uniform standing 30 yards away. "Ilara." Orion's voice was like cracking ice. "What in God's name are you doing here?" The name. Ilara. It echoed in the silent hall, hitting Henry with the force of a physical impact. He stared at his Ilara, the shy waitress. Then he looked at the billionaire CEO who owned his entire world. Then back at her, the simple sweater she was wearing, the one from their walk in the park, the nervous way she had hidden her phone, her strange, intense questions about his work, about Adler, about Orion Blackwood himself. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a romance. It was an interrogation. He had been a project, a source, a fool. The warmth of her kiss turned to poison in his memory. Orion took a step forward, his eyes sweeping over Henry with a look of utter dismissiveness, as if he were an insect that had crawled out of the woodwork. "And who is this?" Ilara's mouth opened, a choked, desperate sound escaping her lips. "Dad, I can explain." "He's—" But before she could weave another lie, Henry spoke. His voice was hollow, stripped of all warmth, all hope. He looked directly at Ilara, his eyes filled with a pain so deep it was bottomless. "Nobody," he said, the single word a devastating verdict on everything he had allowed himself to feel. "I'm nobody." He turned, his movement stiff and mechanical, and began pushing his cart away, the squeak of its wheels the only sound in the crushing silence. He didn't look back. He didn't want to see the pity or the panic on her face. He just wanted to disappear. Ilara stood frozen, her heart shattered into a million pieces. She was trapped in the glare of her father's furious, suspicious eyes, watching the back of the man she loved, the man she had just destroyed, retreat into the shadows. The truth was finally out, and it had burned everything to the ground. The silence on the 58th floor was a weapon. As Henry's footsteps receded, Ilara was left alone to face her father's cold, controlled fury. Orion Blackwood's eyes, usually sharp and analytical, were now glacial. "Explain," he said. The single word was not a request. It was a command. Tears streamed down Ilara's face, but her voice was steady, fueled by a desperation to make him understand. "His name is Henry Callahan. He's a good man, Dad. He's the one who's been noticing things about Adler. He's kind, and he loves his daughter more than anything, and I have feelings for him." "Feelings." Orion repeated the word as if it were a foreign object he'd found in his food. "You were assigned a task, Ilara. Your task was to gather intelligence, not to fraternize with the staff. You allowed your sentiment to compromise not only the mission, but the security of this entire family. You brought a complete stranger into our orbit. He's not a stranger. He's the man I love." "He is a janitor," Orion shot back, his voice slicing through the air. "I forbid you from contacting him again. This attachment is a liability. It is over." Before she could argue, one of his guards approached, holding a plain manila envelope. "Found in your private delivery box, sir." "It was deposited a few minutes ago." Orion took the envelope, his eyes never leaving Ilara's face. He saw the flicker of recognition as she looked at the simple, unadorned packaging. "This was him, wasn't it?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. He tore it open, pulling out the shredded strip of paper and the crumpled napkin. He studied them for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "The matter is now in my hands," he said, tucking the evidence into his inside pocket. "You will go home. You will not leave the penthouse, and you will not speak to Henry Callahan again. We are done here." He turned and strode toward the elevator, leaving her standing alone in the vast, empty hallway, the silence screaming with everything she had just lost. Henry finished his shift in a fog of numb, agonizing pain. Every squeak of his cart, every hum of the lights, felt like an accusation. He had been so stupid. A lonely, foolish man who had mistaken a calculated investigation for genuine affection. Every shared smile, every gentle touch, every moment he had treasured was a lie. a carefully constructed piece of theater. He was a project, a means to an end. When he got home, the sun was just beginning to rise. He walked into Clara's room and watched her sleep, her small chest rising and falling rhythmically. He had almost let the chaos of that other world touch her. He had almost risked this perfect, simple life for a ghost. A quiet, cold rage settled in his chest. He walked back into the living room, took out his phone, and with deliberate, steady fingers, he blocked Ilara's number. He deleted their text conversations, wiping away the digital record of their time together. He erased her, just as she had erased the man he thought he was. At 10 a.m. that morning, Garrick Adler sat across from Orion Blackwood in the Billionaire's stark, intimidating office. "It is with great regret that I bring this to you, Orion," Adler began, his voice oozing a practiced sincerity. "But the results of our internal security audit are conclusive. The leaks, the financial irregularities. We have traced the source. It's an inside job." He slid a thick leather-bound file across the desk. "His name is Henry Callahan, one of our night janitors. His financials show significant distress. We have logs of him accessing secure floors outside his designated work hours. And most damningly, we have reason to believe he is working with an accomplice, a woman with no official identity, likely to help him launder the funds." Orion listened without expression, his fingers steepled under his chin. He did not open the file. "Thank you for your diligence, Garrick," he said, his voice a flat, unreadable monotone. "You may go." Confused by the anticlimactic dismissal, Adler left the office. Ilara, a prisoner in her own home, was frantic. She called Henry's number a dozen times, each call met with the sterile automated message of a blocked number. Desperate, she broke her father's command. She took a taxi to Henry's modest apartment building and waited across the street, a forlorn figure in the bright morning light. An hour later, he emerged, holding Clara's hand. He was taking her to school. Ilara's heart leaped, and she crossed the street, calling his name. "Henry, please." He stopped, his body going rigid. He turned slowly, his face an impassive mask of stone. He gently pushed Clara behind him, shielding her as if Ilara were a threat. "Please, just let me explain," she begged, her voice breaking. "It didn't start that way, but my feelings for you are real." "I swear it, real?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Was it real when you were asking me about my boss? Was it real when you were taking notes for your father? Every conversation we had, every moment. Was it all just research? No, I was falling in love with you." "Stop," he said, the single word cutting her deeper than any shout. "You don't belong here. Your world, my world. They're not meant to mix. You've done your job. You've gotten what you wanted. Now leave us alone." He turned without another word and walked away, holding his daughter's hand tightly, never looking back. Ilara stood on the sidewalk, tears blurring the image of the two people who had become her entire world, walking out of her life forever. Back on the 60th floor, Orion Blackwood sat at his desk. In front of him were two things: Garrick Adler's thick, polished report accusing Henry Callahan, and the two flimsy pieces of evidence Henry had risked everything to deliver: an official narrative and a whispered truth. He picked up his phone and buzzed his head of security. "Get me the unedited security footage from the 58th floor conference room for the last month," he commanded, "and pull the raw data logs for Adler's case against the janitor. I want to see the source code myself. I trust my own eyes before I trust any man's report." He hung up and stared out at the city he owned. He was a man who dealt in facts, not feelings, and he was about to find out what the facts really were. At 10 p.m., as Henry was grimly preparing for another shift, his supervisor approached him, his face pale and grim. "Henry," the man said, his voice low, "they want to see you." Upstairs, Henry's heart dropped. "Upstairs where?" The supervisor wouldn't meet his eyes. "The 60th floor, Henry. Mr. Blackwood's office." Right now, this was it. The trap had been sprung. The lie had been told, and he had been chosen as the sacrifice. His shoulders squared. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but beneath it was the hard, unbending resolve of a man with nothing left to lose. He nodded once, handed his supervisor his cart, and walked toward the private elevator, ready to face the man whose daughter had broken his heart. Henry rode the private elevator to the 60th floor in a state of surreal calm. The fear was still there, a cold stone in his gut, but it was overshadowed by a profound, weary resignation. He had played a game he didn't understand and had lost spectacularly. Now, all that was left was to face the consequences with the dignity he had left. The elevator doors opened directly into a vast, minimalist office that felt more like an art gallery than a workspace. Floor-to-ceiling windows displayed the entire city as a glittering carpet below. Garrick Adler was standing near the window, a smug, triumphant smirk on his face. At the center of the room, behind a desk the size of a small car, sat Orion Blackwood. His face was an unreadable mask of granite. "Mr. Callahan," Orion said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the air. "Thank you for coming. Mr. Adler has presented me with a very thorough report. It accuses you of corporate espionage and alleges a conspiracy to embezzle funds from this company." Adler stepped forward. "The evidence is conclusive, Orion. The manipulated access logs, his financial distress, his connection to an unregistered accomplice." Henry didn't look at Adler. He kept his eyes fixed on the billionaire who held his life in his hands. He thought of Clara, and a surge of strength flowed through him. He would not be a coward. "Sir," Henry said, his voice clear and steady, "I am a janitor. I clean floors. I don't know anything about shell companies or embezzling. All I know is what I saw. I found a shredded piece of paper in Mr. Adler's trash connecting him to a company called Vertex Holdings, and I found a napkin from one of his meetings with the same name on it. I knew it was wrong. I knew it was a secret he didn't want anyone to see. So I brought it to you." He finally turned his gaze to Adler, his eyes hard. "That is the truth." Adler let out a condescending laugh. "The desperate fantasy of a guilty man." "It's pathetic, is it?" Orion asked quietly. He swiveled his large leather chair to face a massive screen on the wall behind him. With a tap on his keyboard, the screen came to life. It showed security footage, crystal clear, of the conference room next to Adler's office. The timestamp matched the date on the crumpled napkin. The footage showed Adler in a hushed, frantic conversation with a man Henry didn't know. It showed Adler scribbling on the napkin and then carelessly tossing it into the recycling bin. Adler's face went white. Orion tapped another key. A complex series of data logs filled the screen, lines of code highlighted in red. "You were right about one thing, Garrick. The logs framing Mr. Callahan were manipulated, but our IT department was able to trace the source of that manipulation. It came from a terminal on the 58th floor. A terminal registered to your head of internal security." A Mr. Jennings Orion's voice dropped, becoming as cold and sharp as a shard of glass. "The evidence Mr. Callahan provided was the one loose thread you failed to account for. It gave me a name and a date, and it allowed me to unravel your entire pathetic little scheme." Orion's gaze was withering. "You are fired. Your assets are frozen, and the authorities are waiting for you in the lobby." Two security guards stepped into the room. Adler, his face a mask of disbelief and rage, was escorted out without another word. Henry stood in stunned silence, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Orion picked up his phone. "Send my daughter up." A minute later, Alara entered the office. She looked pale and heartbroken, her eyes immediately finding Henry. She stopped short when she saw the relief and confusion on his face, not the defeat she had expected. Orion rose from his desk and walked toward them. He stopped in front of Henry, his expression for the first time showing something other than cold command. "I misjudged you, Mr. Callahan. You have more integrity than my entire executive board combined. You risked everything to protect a company that saw you as invisible. I am in your debt." Then, he turned to his daughter. The hardness in his eyes finally softened, replaced by a deep, complicated sorrow. "And I misjudged you," he said, his voice low. "Your mother always said you had an instinct for people, a way of seeing the truth of them. I thought it was a weakness, a sentimentality to be trained out of you." He glanced at Henry, then back at his daughter. "It appears it is your greatest strength. You found a good man, Alara. I was wrong to stand in your way." With that, the great Orion Blackwood did something Henry never thought possible. He turned and walked into his private study, closing the door behind him, leaving them completely alone. The silence in the vast office was deafening. Alara took a hesitant step toward him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Henry?" she whispered. He was no longer angry. The rage had been burned away by the shock of the last hour, leaving only a deep, profound ache. "Why?" was all he could ask. "Why all of it?" "Because I was a coward," she said, her voice breaking as the truth spilled out. "I was hiding behind a mission my father gave me, and I was too afraid to tell him, and too afraid to tell you, that the mission had become a distant second to my feelings for you. The way I met you was a lie, Henry. I will not insult you by pretending it wasn't. But the way I fell in love with you, in that diner, in the park, watching you with Clara, that was the most real thing that has ever happened to me. I am so sorry I broke your trust." She stood before him, stripped of all her defenses, her heart in her eyes. He saw the shy waitress from the diner. He saw the kind woman who had helped his daughter win a unicorn. He saw the billionaire's daughter who had defied her father. And he realized they were all the same person. "It's going to take time, Alara," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You broke my trust. You broke me a little." He took a step closer, closing the distance between them. "But my heart, when I see you, it still feels the same way it did at the street fair." The weeks that followed were a slow, careful rebuilding. True to his word, it took time. Alara worked to earn back his trust not with grand gestures or gifts from her father's fortune, but with the simple, priceless currency of consistency and honesty. She showed up. She called when she said she would. She spent afternoons in their small apartment helping Clara with homework, her presence filling the space with a quiet warmth. She introduced him to her world, not as an heiress, but as a daughter, and he, in turn, allowed her back into his. 1 year later, Henry stood under the shade of a massive oak tree in the city's botanical garden. A small group of friends and family were gathered on the manicured lawn. He watched as Clara, dressed in a lavender dress and clutching a basket of rose petals, walked slowly and seriously down the makeshift aisle. Behind her was Alara, not in a lavish designer gown, but in a simple, elegant white dress that seemed to glow in the afternoon sun. She met him at the front, her hand finding his. Her father, Orion, sat in the front row, a genuine peaceful smile on his face. When it was time for their vows, Henry turned to her, his heart full to bursting. "I once stood in an office on the 60th floor and told a billionaire I was a nobody," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought my world was small, but standing here today, with you and with Clara, I finally understand. I have everything. You are my everything." Alara squeezed his hand, her own tears flowing freely. "And I once thought my world was about buildings and boardrooms," she whispered back. "But you showed me what it means to build a life." "You were never nobody to me, Henry. From the moment I saw you with Clara in that diner, you were my home. And so, we place another story onto the shelf. Each one of these feels like a different little world we get to visit for a while, doesn't it? I have a question for you. If you were building a library of human experiences, what title would you give this story? The Art of Forgiveness? A Long Road Home? I'm genuinely curious what you'd label it. Drop your title in the comments. This library is something we are all building together. When you subscribe, you're helping us find and preserve the next story that needs to be told. The like button just helps new visitors find this particular aisle. It is an absolute honor to be building this collection with you. Thank you for everything. I'll see you for the next one.